Instead, they will be priests of God and of Christ. Now, this too is a little bit of a problematic statement, because it says they will be priests of God and of Christ. But at the beginning of the book, John said that Christ had made them to be a kingdom, priests serving God. Right? So they were already priests before they died as Christians. So what does it mean they will be priests of God and of Christ?
Recognition of being a Christian in life and after.
Okay, maybe the kind of a recognition of what they did in life. How else might we understand it? What else might we think of to understand this?
Maybe a chance to reach or teach.
Well, what was the function of the priests in the Old Testament in the Bible? All right, so sacrifices, service to God, right? They were the ones that could approach God. And so the priest notion here is of service or being involved in worship. And so even though they're reigning, they will also be serving, worshiping God. Right? So it's not saying they weren't priests on earth, because John says, right, He's made us to be a kingdom, priests, right? So if we've put on Christ, we are, in a sense, a priest. And so this priesthood is in heaven, right? Serving God face to face, serving God there in heaven. So those involved in the resurrection will still be serving, still be worshiping. And they'll do it for 1,000 years. Well, probably longer than that, right? I mean, it's not 1,000 years and then, retirement in heaven. But the idea here is that they'll be serving God and worshiping God during this entire period, however long it really is. But when the 1,000 years are ended, and suggesting again the binding and the reigning at the same period, when that takes place, the end of the 1,000 new years, Satan will be released. This is the little time. Now, why is he being released? Why would God release him? Probably the same reason God allows Satan to do anything, to ultimately prove who is really faithful and who isn't. But the binding will be loosed. Is this total release? No, even here it's not total release. Right? Satan is always under God's control. But what is being released here? Well, his ability to deceive the nations. Right? So keep that in its context and understand. Right? He'll be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations. And so that's what the release is. Not that during the 1,000 years Satan won't be active, but that he'll be restricted in going the direction he has been going. And the nations that he's specifically coming for are those that are at the four corners of the earth that John identifies as Gog and Magog. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, we read Hunter read for us from chapter 39 earlier. Gog in Ezekiel was the name of a king who was coming against Israel. Magog was his land. Right? So it's Gog from the land of Magog. Here, it almost sounds like Gog and Magog are two different people. Maybe, or two different nations, I should say. Maybe that's the case. We've certainly seen where John is referring to things in the prophets, but changing them around a little bit, right, because of the images that he's seeing. And so perhaps that's going on. Perhaps it is meant to say Gog, this king, who is part of Magog, the land. Either way, the point, while we can debate that, essentially he's referring to these nations that Satan is gathering. And he's gathering them, he's deceiving them to gather them for battle. Here too, this battle is different than the gathering of the forces at Armageddon. Right? So there have been two battles after the Battle of Armageddon. So the Battle of Armageddon isn't the last battle to end the world, because there are two battles after it. Because remember, the beast and the false prophet were involved in the Battle of Armageddon, and they've already been thrown into the lake of fire. And so here is, again, an attempt to go against God's people. Satan using nations to go after God's people. They are numerous as the sands of the sea. Now, when you hear that phrase, or you read that phrase, they're numerous as the sands of the sea, what does that call to mind, that phrase? The children of Abraham. Right? That Abraham was promised by God, right, that his descendants would be like the stars of the sky, like the sand of the sea, right? Innumerable. Well, this is meant to suggest that there's this immense group of people that stand with Satan, right? And they're coming from the entirety of the earth. And to suggest how massive these armies apparently are. Which, of course, we already know. It doesn't matter how many people Satan gets together, God is always going to defeat him, which kind of spoils the ending, but would be a reminder to them as well as to us in the contemporary period that no matter how bad it looks, no matter how much the world seems to be against followers of Christ, that Christ is always in control and will always be victorious. Which is difficult to hold on to if you see the army surrounding the camp. And so this is the image here, right? Gog and Magog have come from all places around the earth and are surrounding the camp of the saints, surrounding the church. And the beloved city, or the beloved city. So what's the beloved city? Yeah, we would usually think Jerusalem, but is it meant to be the literal city of Jerusalem? Here again, probably not, especially as we go into chapter 21 and see the new Jerusalem. Right? And so, beloved city, the camp of the saints, refer to the same thing, the church, and not specifically the city of Jerusalem. Once again, there is no battle. 3 times now, Satan has tried to gather armies for a battle, and there hasn't been one. And I think also, when we think of these passages, we should understand them as spiritual battles, not physical ones, even to begin with. Looking at passages like Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12, where it says, we fight not against flesh and blood. And talking about taking on the whole armor of God. Right? How does Jesus succeed in battle? With the sword from his mouth, from the word of God. Right? Not physical battle, it is a spiritual battle. But if these things are referring to events to take place before the end, does this mean that there will be a worldwide persecution of Christians before the end? Well, obviously, of course, it depends on where you find yourself. As futurist, idealist, in a sense, the idealist position, Christians have been persecuted throughout centuries. I tend to think that it doesn't. I'm not completely sure what it means, but I tend to think it doesn't mean there's going to be a worldwide persecution before the end, because of two ideas that Jesus expresses in his teaching about the end. First, what is the most common phrase that Jesus uses to talk about his second coming? Like a thief in the night. Right? No signs. Well, could worldwide persecution serve as a sign? Yeah, but persecution has happened. So, I mean, it's one of those things where if it is a sign, it's not a very good sign. Right? How do you tell which persecution is the last one? Secondly, his warnings to the disciples that they are to stay awake because you don't know the day or the hour. So I don't think necessarily there will be a specific persecution we can point to as this is it. But I think in some ways the idealist position probably is a good one to take here, is that Satan, anytime he has the chance, is always going to try and use persecution to go after Christ's followers. And so not so much about specifically watch out for that last persecution at the end, but more of when Satan tries this, remember he's always going to be defeated. Because Satan finally gets his due. He's thrown into the lake of fire, and so this too, this here, I believe, is futurist. Even though a lot of what I understand Revelation to be is past to us, I believe this is futurist here, because I believe this does refer to the ultimate end of Satan here. Right? There is no escape, in a sense, from the lake of fire. And remember, John reminds us, right? This is where the beast and the false prophet work. And so this is where the devil ends up. He receives his last punishment with his allies. And they too will be tormented day and night, forever and ever. Right? Not just forever and ever. It's like infinity plus one. Right? You know, in case you really weren't sure it's never going to end, I'll say and ever. And so this will be an eternal punishment that the beast and the false prophet and the dragon undergo. Then, says John, right, he's just watched the dragon finally be defeated. Then I saw a great white throne, and the one who sat on it. And so we have a great judgment scene. Again, this is probably where the preterists, the historicists, the idealists, and the futurists all line up. Most people would say, this is it. Right? No matter what happened before, this is it. And this is the last judgment. Revelation is talking about future events from this point on, everybody would agree. But even though everybody would agree on this, I think we still have to say, okay, it's got to make sense to them first. Well, a notion of a last judgment, of reward, of punishment, would make sense to first century Christians. And so I think that makes sense as to why everybody would end up agreeing on this point. Everyone will have to stand before God. But certainly what we're kind of in calling it a great white throne, the immensity of it, and of course the purity of God. And from the presence of the one seated on the throne, the earth and the heaven fled. Now this might be symbolic of the nature of the judge, right? Nobody can stand before the judge. Even the universe itself falls before the judge. I think, and probably most people would say, this probably refers to the destruction of the universe. Right? The last judgment, it's going to involve the heaven and the earth being destroyed. Reflected in that next phrase, no place was found for them. And so probably means the destruction of the universe. And chapter 21, of course, also says that the first heaven and the first earth passed away. And so that's another reason why I think this is referring to the destruction of the physical universe. So John sees a great white throne, seated on the throne. Again, he doesn't say it, but we're led to believe, of course, that this is God. Also, in the presence of the throne are the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne. Everybody, right? No matter where you were in life, you're standing before that great white throne. And books were open. What are these books? Chronicles of Narnia, Huckleberry Finn, the I Ching. And saying books were open, what What's being symbolized here?
Life story.
Yeah, this is kind of just records, right? And it will say, you know, they're judged according to things in their books, but records are going to be opened at the judgment. And so the books were open. But in contrast to the books being open, there is another book. Okay, so there's the books and the book. In contrast to the books is the book of life. And this contrast, of course, is very important. Because it seems like the books include things about everybody. But there's only certain people in the book of life. And so the records are kind of opened as the great judge makes his examination. And the dead are judged according to their works, as recorded in the books. You almost get the feeling like God has been making a list, checking it twice. He's going to find out if it may not. But the idea is that the things people have done have been recorded in these books. Unless you think, Christians hearing this in the first century or Christians reading it today, unless you think you can escape being in those books, the sea gives up the dead, death and Hades gives up the dead. No matter where you are, no matter how you died, you're going to show up at that great white throne judgment. And of course, John doesn't talk about a specific group of people. Those living at the end of time when Jesus returns. And he's been talking about the dead. Well, the people living at the time that Jesus returns aren't really a focus of John, just like the second resurrection isn't talked about. It doesn't mean, of course, that the living at the end of time won't be judged as well. Matthew chapter 25 talks about that. So everybody will be judged. Everyone, no matter where they were, how they tried to escape God, they will appear. And again, John emphasizes that they will be judged according to what they had done. And after the judgment, death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. Now we've seen death and Hades personified in other places in Revelation, but essentially what it's saying is the idea of death will be destroyed. The realm where the dead go will be destroyed as well. They're no longer needed. This is it. And so death and Hades are no longer needed. And this, we're finally told, is the second death. The lake of fire. That eternal death that waits. But who does it wait for? It waits for anyone whose name is not written in the book of life. It's thrown into the lake of fire. The beast and the prophet, the dragon, death and Hades, and now anyone whose name not found in the book of life is thrown into the lake of fire. So what's your hope? Your hope is your name's in that book of life. Right? That's the hope. And of course, a warning to those first century Christians, warning to any Christians at any time who were thinking about compromising their faith, tempted by Satan to turn away from Christ. And the warning is there. Where's your name going to be when you stand before that great white throne? A very horrific scene we've encountered over the past couple chapters, but it's going to change completely next week as we get into chapter 21 and 22, seeing what awaits those whose names are in the book of life.